Hello, welcome to Derby Vineyard Church's Sermon of the Week.
So let's begin. Like I say every week, my name is Andrew, together with Jane, privilege of leading Derby Vineyard. Thank you for coming out this morning. So we're going to continue in our series in Ephesians this morning, and as I've said the past few weeks, it's a game of... Oh, thank you, Dave. Thank you. At least somebody's listening. I was thinking Emma might get there, but, you know, she's just chatting away, and now she'd be really embarrassed. There we go. So it's a game of two halves. First half, Paul is celebrating the Gentiles, the non-Jews coming to faith, and the second half is about how to live that out. So over the past couple of weeks, we've looked at the start of chapter 4, and the theme of the start of chapter 4 is unity. So I get these emails, and this headline caught my eye about something that's happening in Derby. So I don't know if maybe you've missed this, but Rolls-Royce have landed a £9 billion contract to build. You know, they build, even though Derbyshire is a nuclear-free zone, they build nuclear engines for nuclear submarines. So at £9,000 million, that's, you know, it's a mind-boggling sum of money. And I think it's 1,000 new jobs at Royce's. They've built new buildings at Rainsway. You know, I don't know about nuclear submarines, but I do know that is going to be good for the economy of Derby. So it's quite interesting, and it's funny how we don't hear these things. You know, the reason I know about it is because I've signed up to this thing called Marketing Derby, where a guy celebrates the good things that are happening in Derby. And it caught my eye because unity. I don't know why they've called the contract Unity, but anyway, that was the theme over the past couple of weeks of the passage that we looked at. And you perhaps don't realise it because we live here and we're not really aware of what it's like in the rest of the country. But Derby really has it going on in terms of manufacturing. I think there's another slide, but at Alstom, you know, the people who used to be Bombardier build trains, they built 270-odd new rail cars for the the longest monorail in the world. It's going to be in Cairo, and so they built these. There we go. There's Cairo. They built these. You know, they built these trains, and it'll carry, I think, 45,000 passengers an hour. This train will, so you know, so it's quite impressive stuff, you know, and then that supports hundreds of jobs, you know, and of course there's Toyota as well, and like I was saying, Derby is just, and if you compare it to the rest of the country, obviously you've got London, and the highest average salary in London is going to be higher than the rest of the country, and then the cities where people who work in London live, so that's going to bump things up. But if you move away from the south, Derby's up there as one of the richest, you know, in terms of average salary, richest places in the country. You know, we're up there with Aberdeen and Edinburgh, and they have money from oil. So it's quite interesting what's going on with Derby. One of the other reasons I'm interested in this is because of this fellow, William Wilkins. Now, if you've been around for a while, you might have heard me talk about him before, but, you know, the Wilkins Centre. So the Wilkins Centre is it used to be the Theatre Gospel Hall, the church that ran the Theatre Gospel Hall, and then, you know, as things moved on, they bought that building, and that's the building they gave us. This guy, William Wilkins, served as mayor a couple of times back in it would have been the 1800s, and he knew that if kids were going to learn, they couldn't learn if they were hungry. So he would give, you know, thousands of breakfasts out to kids every year because, you know, if you're hungry, you can't learn. So, and I think that part of his legacy is the way that Derby is doing so well. You know, who knows who one of those kids was, you know, that came up with the idea that became Royce's or Bombardier. Do you see what I mean? What a legacy. So it's nice to be kind of involved in that. I've really enjoyed putting these talks together, and it's been really interesting having time to kind of enforced time. How sometimes you don't do things unless you're really forced to do it. So it's been nice to have enforced time to think about, the things that are going on in Ephesians. So we're going to continue in chapter 4. So the first part was about unity, and the second part is about kind of righteousness and purity and that kind of thing. So let's read the passage. Yeah, that's all right. So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. That, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught, with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. It was Valentine's Day the other day, a couple of days ago, and fortunately, I'm looking out and there's no signs of panic, so nobody forgot who was supposed to remember. We had there was a Valentine's kind of event last night at the Wilkins Centre that Wallace and Tatiana and their family put on, and it was lovely. We had a really lovely time, so thank you very much, Wallace. It was great, yeah, and there's lots of people nodding around the room. And so, did you know, you perhaps do know this, it was news to me, but the Valentine's Day thing wasn't something that a card company came up with, unlike other things that we celebrate. It was actually Saint Valentine. And the tradition has it that he was a guy who would marry Christian soldiers who weren't supposed to get married. Sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it, that? But I think the Romans said that the soldiers weren't to marry, or something like that. So he did this, and so he ended up in prison. And while he was in prison, he prayed for the jailer's daughter, and she was healed. So he was a martyr, and so there's a day in the calendar when, in tradition, people would celebrate Valentine, and of course, our secular society, consumerism, takes it over and turns it into something else. But that's the origin of it. So interesting how Christianity is all, woven into our society, even if we don't see it. So, and in that kind of vein, can I tell you a story? Jane and I have been married 27 years, over 27 years. And I know that I must have been married when I was like 3 or something like that. So, but this is a story, it goes back to the time when we were on honeymoon. So at the time I worked for Birmingham Vineyard. It was quite a big church. I was really involved doing all sorts of things. In fact, so much so that when we left, they closed one of the services. They stopped doing the evening service because they just couldn't cope without me. So that's what I think anyway. And Andrew, actually, the guy who leads it, publicly thanked me after I'd left, to just thank you for everything that you used to do, and like they were struggling without me. So consequently, when it was Sunday morning service, after the service, there would be a queue of people, waiting to ask me questions. How do you do this? What about this? And, all that kind of thing, because I was so involved in everything. So we're on honeymoon, and it's the Sunday before I go back to work, and I'm like, I don't really want to go to our church because, inevitably there'll be a queue of people. So we thought we'd go to a different church, and it's quite an experience going to a different church because you don't know the way in, you don't know where you're going and all that kind of thing. And believe it or not, this is the days before the internet. So we go to this, we met in a school, and we head round the back of this building and through this little door, and eventually we find ourselves in the school hall, and it's all sort of set up really nicely. There's a couple of 100 chairs out, a big band, and a nice PA system, the whole deal, really, really nice thing. But there was like me, Jane, and 5 other people, and we were there on time. or as most new people do, we arrived a few minutes early, which is very interesting. If you want to, I'm just going to get off the point of getting off the point, but if you want to make a big impact, come early. You know, if new people come and they walk into a room that's empty, their first impression is, oh, I'm not sure about this. But if you come in anyway, you know, come 10 minutes early or whatever, it makes a huge difference. So anyway, we go to this church, and you know, there's me and Jen and a few others, more people in the band than there were in the congregation. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And it was great. You know, the worship started, it was great. And as it went on, for quite some time, the church filled up. And so you know, the service is going on. And by the time the guy got up to speak, obviously he was the main event because the place was full by that point. So he starts speaking, and he goes on and on and on. I'm like, and it was 2 hours. He spoke for 2 hours. Now, I wonder if the reason I can remember what he said was because he just kept repeating and repeating. So, because none of you can remember what I spoke about last week, I'm going to go on this week for... No, not really. The thing he talked about was repentance, and how he explained that was to change your mind. And he kept using this phrase, change your mind, change your mind, change your mind, over and over and over, and change your mind, change your mind. Now, this is Birmingham, and, you know, they have a bit of an accent in Birmingham, which I don't think any of you have, so I'm on safe ground. And as you go west from Birmingham into the Black Country, it gets a bit stronger. So it wasn't just change your mind, it was change your mind. Change your mind, change your mind, over and over and over. Who's going over there? No, stop now. Anyway, yeah. If you go to the West Country, it's to the Black Country. Sorry, it's it is almost like a different language. They use different words for. Anyway, change your mind. So, I'm completely off the point now. So yes, let's get back to the passage. So we'll start. Verse 1. So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. One of the things that struck me about Ephesians is the way that it's so well put together. You know, sometimes you could be forgiven for thinking that Paul's on a rant and he's just, you know, the scribe is writing it down as fast as he could. But actually Paul is thought through the structure of the letter. And for me as an engineer, the structure is quite, you know, it really helps me to get my head around it. I know if you're more artistic, you're probably happy with the free-flowing thing, but, you know, seeing the structure is really helpful. And so if you compare this verse, so verse 17, the start of this little passage, with the first verse, there's parallels. So you see how he says, in verse 17, he insists on it in the Lord. He uses the same sort of thing in verse 1. I urge you. And then he talks about how to live. You know, don't live as the Gentiles do, but live a life worthy of your calling. You see how it's like that? So they've put paragraphs and headings in our Bibles, but he had it in his mind that these were different sections. So the first section was about unity, like I said, and this next one is about kind of holiness and purity and righteousness. I like the way that the New Century Version puts it. So in the verse 17, in the Lord's name, I tell you this: do not continue living like those who do not believe. Their thoughts are worth nothing. And that I find that helpful to get that, because in the NIV it talks about Gentiles, but the whole thing is about the Gentiles coming to faith, so it's very confusing. But in the NCV it talks about those who don't continue like those who do not believe. So that's helpful, and that's a little thing that I've learned, or maybe the Lord's taught me or something. You know, if you don't understand it in one version of the Bible, look at it in a different version. And sometimes the emphases that they're bringing out in the other version really help to understand it. And then he also uses this phrase, in the Lord's name. So Paul is saying what he's writing with the Lord's authority. Their thoughts are worth nothing, it says. And there's kind of a popular misconception that people at churches sort of, when they come, we don't have a coat rack, but, when you come in, you hang up your coat on the coat rack by the door. And there's a popular misconception that Christians do that with their brains and leave them by the door, and to actually believe the stuff that we believe, you just can't have thought it through. And that is not the case at all. There's a lot of clever people who are Christians. I know some of you are revising for GCSE physics at the moment, and you'll have done Newton's. Yes, you are. Yeah, and you'll have done some laws by Newton. Yeah, Newton's second law and all that kind of thing. Some of you, it's like so long ago, you've forgotten about that. But we have got people in the room who've got.
Can't remember his first.
Does anybody know that? How many? I think there are at least 3 people in this room who've got physics degrees. Yeah, is that it? I don't know. Is that second? Or is it thermodynamics? Anyway, this wasn't supposed to be a physics lesson. Most of you done with school. And yes, anyway, there we go. As again, I've got off the point. So, yeah, there's a lot of clever people who are, who are Christians. That's my point. So I came across this video. I won't play it now because it's a few minutes long. There's a fellow called John Lennox, who is a mathematician, very clever bloke. I think he's a professor at one of the Oxford colleges. And he gave a talk at an Oxford college. They're all dressed up in their dinner jackets. And he's giving this talk about why he believes, his faith. And it's a really logical, thought-through argument from somebody who's very clever. And one of the things about the misconception of us hanging our brains by the, with the coats by the door, one of the guys who kind of is a proponent of that argument is this guy, Richard Dawkins. He was actually in the lecture. And you see in the video, he looks very uncomfortable as John Lennox is just going through, knocking down all the kind of atheist arguments. So if you get 15 minutes, and you want to look that up, it's quite interesting. And I would encourage you to use your brains to think things through, to ask questions. That is something that we're more than happy to think about. To use your brain, think about what's going on in the passages, about some of the issues that we're facing. How do we respond to those as Christians? This short passage we're going to look at today is again in 2 halves. Like the whole book. And the first part of the passage is about people who don't believe, and the second is about encouraging us to have faith. And it kind of begs the question, this passage, about being different from those around you. So just for a minute, think about how different you are from those around you. And the point isn't to be different for the sake of being different, but if we're living our lives to the beat of a different drum, we're going to be different to those people around us. And if you look at any aspect of your life, how different is it to those that, your contemporaries? How is your language? How are your career choices? How's your attitude to money, to your search history, how you treat your wife, the car you drive, all that kind of thing? It all has an impact. Our faith has an impact on that. And we're going to stand out. We're going to be different to the people around us. I went to my engineering job a couple of times this week. I went into the office. And the guys, I try and look interested, but, they're talking about money and cars and, how much extra money they're putting in their pension so they can retire early. And, and I try and look interested, but, there are bigger things going on in the world. There's more interesting things. And one of the things that I've found as I've followed Jesus is I get to live an interesting life. I get to meet some really interesting people from all sections of society. I get to, talk to refugees, help people get involved reintegrating into our society or getting integrated. We've met Afghans and Syrians and Iranians, all kind of interesting people, and get to experience their food and their culture. And for me, it's interesting. I've travelled all over the world, doing Christian things, but it's just, I don't know. There's a heck of a difference between I went to California for a bit as part of a church, got to know the people there. There's a heck of a difference between that and just, flying in to go to the Grand Canyon and flying home. Do you see what I mean? It's just, being a Christian is an interesting way to live. It opens up all these opportunities. So as I've thought about this passage this week, a couple of questions have come to mind. Why bother? Why bother? Why bother putting off the old self and putting on the new self? And there he puts it in the passage. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which has been corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, to change your mind. And to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Holiness means kind of set apart, like God, different. And it's almost like he's describing taking off the old clothes, putting on the new ones. And why bother with that? Well, I think the answer sort of comes at the end of the passage, where it talks about, Paul is asking us to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. And that word righteousness is really interesting. We perhaps don't see it so much in when we're reading the Bible, but the word righteous and righteousness shows up over 700 times in the Bible. So it's obviously a kind of a key theme. And if you go, like right back to the beginning of the Bible, it talks about when God is talking to Abram, who became Abraham, your offspring will be as many as the stars. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And then Psalm 23, and if you hear last week, I managed to do it from memory, and but I'm not going to do it now. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And Jesus talked about it a lot. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. So it's a key thing. And I should have warned you about this, Alyssa. I'm sorry. There's a 1 minute video. Don't forget to put the sound on. That talks about righteousness and tries to explain it a little bit.
Dikaiosune. How good is life for those who hunger and thirst for dikaiosune, because they will be satisfied. Dikaiosune, or righteousness, means living in right relationship with God, other people, and all creation. We act with righteousness when we live justly, honestly, and faithfully according to God's instruction. In Jesus' teachings, righteousness describes not only fasting and prayer, but also giving generously to the poor, forgiving others, and loving our enemies. To live this way is to do right by God. God also does righteousness towards us. That is, he does right by his covenant promises to people, to send Israel's promised Messiah to renew the world. In accordance with his promise, we wait for new heavens and a new earth where Dikaiosune is at home.
So righteousness. And wouldn't you like that? Wouldn't you like peace with God, peace with each other? Wouldn't we like peace in our world? Surely that is worth more than anything else. And that seems like a pretty good reason to put off the old way of thinking and put on the new. And by the way, John Wimber, the guy who helped start the Vineyard in the first place, before he even became a Christian or anything, he was involved in a band called the Righteous Brothers. Because it was like, totally righteous dude, that kind of thinking. So how do we do this? Do we put off the old and put on the new? Well, the way is to change your mind, to change the way that you think. And you know how sometimes the best way to learn something is to watch somebody else doing it badly? I don't know if you've ever ever experienced that at work, especially when you're new to something. If you watch somebody do something badly, you can learn an awful lot from that. If it goes well, you don't realise that the mistakes that they're avoiding. But anyway, so if you look at this passage, the first part of it, there's a sort of a progression that works through it. And actually, Paul uses this progression elsewhere. He uses it in Romans and I think in Colossians as well. So it starts out, people are obstinate, they're hard-hearted. And then that leads them into darkness. In the passage, it talks about the futility of their thinking, they're darkened in their understanding, the ignorance that is in them. And that then sort of leads to death or judgment. They're separated from their life with God. And that in turn leads to recklessness. Having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they're full of greed. And I get the impression with that verse there, it's kind of sanitized for our reading. It's actually much worse than that, their impurity, and probably involved running around with no clothes on and things of that sort of ilk. So anyway, let's stay away from that. So if you can learn something from the way things are done wrong, if we invert that progression, so instead of being hard-hearted, we're soft-hearted to the Lord, responsive to his voice. And being like that brings light and understanding, which in turn gives us life with God, which leads to righteousness, peace with God, other people, and all creation, and even ourselves. I don't know if you've ever thought about this sort of decision-making process and what goes on up here. When you make a decision, you don't just say something. There's kind of a cognitive process that goes on beforehand. And I'm no psychologist, so I don't know much about that kind of thing. But there's sort of a thing where neurons have to do something before, it makes sense, doesn't it? So if you always think in the same way, it's almost like you're cutting a groove, like on a record. And you may think, well, I'm not a creature of habit. I can predict where people are going to sit. So Charlie and Emma always sit over here. Heather has booked the trend, but she usually sits on the end over there. So do you see what I mean? We are creatures of habit. And that might be because of, I don't know about the psychology of it, but it might be because in our brains we have a way of doing things. And we maybe have a way of thinking as well. So what I'm thinking is, this idea of changing your mind might mean a little bit of effort to think in a different way. If I'm going to go down this path, and often the thing with sin is that it's like, if you end up, you don't want to, you wouldn't go straight to running around with no clothes on. You'd start somewhere, further back. I'm just wondering about whether to, no. Oh no! Oh, what the police things that you watch? No, what they call the crime shows. You don't know what I'm talking about. Jane likes to watch crime shows, and in the story it always seems to follow the same sort of plot. What they call murder mysteries, detective dramas. That's the word I'm looking for. I should have written this down before. And it always sort of starts out the same way. Somebody makes a minor misdemeanor, I don't know, spends too much money or gets in trouble, so they have to take out a loan. And then that leads to something else. And then the crime syndicate get involved. And then there's a murder. And then, and so on. But you see the progression. Whereas if they didn't make that mistake in the first place, then it wouldn't lead to a story. But, of course, then there'd be no show. And what's that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and I wonder if that's how there's a progression in that passage. There's often a progression with us. We make a mistake, and then that leads to this, and that leads to that, and so on. So, if we try and stay soft-hearted to the Lord, then that helps us avoid the mistake in the first place. And then I know it doesn't always work out like that, but that's something to think about anyway. And then my last thought is just about how important Jesus is to this process of living a life that's right with him. In that verse 21, when you heard about Christ and you were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. So if you imagine a school, Jesus is the subject, the thing that we're learning about, the subject of the class. But he's also the teacher, because he's teaching us about himself. And he's also the context in which we learn, the environment of it all. And if you think about the vine, we're a vineyard church, aren't we? It seems really appropriate to think about that, because if we think of ourselves as grapes, a grape doesn't grow so well if it's not connected to the vine, to Jesus. And so making him the subject of our lives, the thing that we're focused on, that is so helpful in this. And this is the way the Lord seems to like to work. He likes to work in partnership with us. He goes part of the way, but he needs us to go part of the way too. And he just wants to walk hand in hand with us, teaching us about himself as we walk with him. And part of this is just spending time with him. And that's one of the reasons the Vineyard sets up the services in the way that it does. The way that we worship. Charlie didn't know what I was going to say this morning, but, this kind of idea of lingering in the Lord's presence, establishing that connection with him, the way that we have ministry time at the end. And often when people pray for me, I'm not really interested in what they've got to say. I'm trying to listen to the Lord and see what he has to say to me. And so, I've taken my glasses off and I can't see now. And just as one final thought, like I said, it was Valentine's Day. Some of us went out on dates. Maybe we could put a date in the diary of time with the Lord, spend an evening with him, or, that kind of thing, to work on our connection with him. So, let's stand together and then we'll pray.
We hope you were encouraged by this message. If you'd like to find out more about Derby Vineyard Church, you can go to derbyvineyard.com or search for us on Instagram and Facebook.